Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Well, this is the loveliest of reasons to be back in Glasgow. I was absolutely tickle pink when Emily invited me to this because I think it might be the nicest invitation I've got as an academic. Just here in purely celebratory, no stress reason. I don't think I'm ever invited to university for those reasons. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm an old lady now, so I need to do the glasses bit to actually read the speech and also because I can't memorize things anymore. But anyways, we shall go. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Newstack, and I used to have the pleasure of working with Emily, and it's now my great pleasure to be here for this event. When Emily invited me to give this introduction to her inaugural lecture, she was very clear on the remit. Please do come and tell everyone how amazing I am. But please do it as quickly as possible, as I need a lot of time myself to give everyone a very detailed evidence base about how amazing I am. In fact, I am slightly suspicious that the only reason she asked me is entirely due to my reputation for speaking quickly. More seriously, when Emily asked me to do this, I could not have been more honoured to have the privilege to introduce another professor of teaching and learning, an academic whose educational and moral compass I do so admire. When I began my lecturing career in 2000, real research was still unquestionably the king. And scholarship and pedagogical research had a bad rap, sometimes deservedly so due to its poor quality. So the question became how to change this and how to provide space and opportunity for real leadership. Equal recognition and meaningful change in teaching and learning in higher education. Many people worked to address this question, and as a small part of this, I was very fortunate with some excellent colleagues like Moira to work on a HEA project between 2012 and 2013, looking at this for the University of Glasgow. The purpose of this project was to tackle the apparent tension between research excellence and teaching excellence, and to ensure promotion pathways for teaching-focused academics that were fair, rigorous, and evidenced international impact. In designing this T&L promotion pathway at the University of Glasgow, the ambition was to create a space and high standard for teaching-focused academics to excel in and to aspire to. To reform a space that had been so marginalized, so undervalued, so unstandardized in the past that it was virtually impossible to excel in it or have aspirations for it. To me, when we were imagining the very best possible outcomes of this project and pathways, and the kinds of excellence in teaching and learning the project would enable, that would impact not just the University of Glasgow, but teaching and learning internationally, we imagined academics like Professor Emily Nordmann. Academics whose rigor and excellence enhances and challenges teaching and learning practice on an international level. However, creating a space is one thing. A path is one thing. The success of these theoretical pathways are only made real by those who take up the mantle. Emily not only took up the mantle, she's one of those continuing to develop the pathway into something even better than we could have imagined. Where we did not dream big enough, she is showing us the higher reality. Even more impressive is that on every step of her path forwards, Emily is always looking back to consider how to open the path for others and make changes for the better, for students, for academic peers, for the discipline of psychology, and for higher education. Emily and I met when she attended a workshop that we offered at Glasgow University. And it was clear to me from that day that she was the academic equivalent of lightning in a bottle, and that we needed to seize the opportunity to add her unique set of talents to our teaching and learning team and the Department of Psychology. When Emily joined us in 2018, we were on the brink of significant amount of curriculum and pedagogical change within the department, and I knew that Emily would be the perfect fit to help us drive through that transformative phase, and she was, and she did, and more. The more kind of defines Emily. As her line manager between 2018 and 2022, I never assigned her a task, allocated her teaching, asked her to lead people, asked her to lead change where she didn't exceed my expectations. And my expectations, as a lot of people in this room know, are high. During the 4 years we worked together, it was an absolute pleasure to watch her grow and develop from a lecturer to a leader. Now her international reputation as a leading thinker in teaching and learning in higher education is very well established. Emily describes her leadership style as a blend of transformational and pragmatic, and while I wholeheartedly agree that this is accurate, I would add a caveat. To me, Emily's genius as an academic generally, and most essentially as a leader in the field of teaching and learning, is her ability to cut through the unnecessary, like Occam's razor to the necessary, while maintaining quality. So when Emily describes her leadership as pragmatic, yes, it is, but never to the lowest baseline. Her baseline for good quality is most people's bar for excellence. She is just exceptionally good at identifying unnecessary noise and eliminating it from the process. The other word that I consider integral in describing Emily's leadership and its impact is courageous. Not fearless, as all leaders should have a modicum of fear to keep them in touch with reality. But being courageous is not a quality that all good leaders necessarily have, and it is necessary for transformative leadership, particularly within higher education. If we take, for example, her lecture capture work, we need to remember how much she was swimming against the tide in articulating best practice when she first started publishing within this area, and the levels of antagonism she often encountered, to which she always responded in a balanced way with evidence to support her position. Emily is never afraid to challenge the status quo and ask, what is the evidence for this? I know she frequently challenged me. Equally, she never dismisses individuals' fears and concerns. Her first step is always to ask the question, why? Her second step is always to get the evidence for an informed answer. And her third step is always to design free, open access materials to address people's fears and enable them to access best practice easily. The reason that Emily's leadership is so effective and has such a pervasive impact internationally is that she ensures everything that she advocates for to make meaningful change is well evidenced, is achievable, and she openly provides the tools to make it easily so. This courage of purpose is again evident in her work around inclusion. At earlier stages in her career, Emily had tried to do some of this work around inclusion, particularly around LGBTQ+, and unfortunately had encountered some really negative experiences and hit a lot of brick walls. For many, these experiences would understandably have had them retreating under the parapet and giving up the fight, but not our Emily. Emily understands that leadership means everyone feeling included, and she is never afraid to use her voice in support or defense of others. Leading is easy when everybody is heading in the same direction. Emily understands that the complexity in leadership and how to successfully navigate through it when we're all on different journeys. When I first met Emily in 2018, she told me two things. I want your job, and I will be the first professor of swearing before I'm 40. And I distinctly remember thinking, I think you would probably skip my job and go straight for a dean role. And I believe that you will be a professor by 40, and I'd like to do what I can to help you on that path. It did involve some swearing, but look at you now, Emily. It's almost like I can predict the future. What I will say now, though, is look out, Moira. She's coming for your job. And she will have told you that, yeah. She's very open in that. For me, one of the key roles of the professor on the learning and teaching track is to provide role models to academics coming up through the system. And in Emily, I can think of no better role model. I know she inspires me to be and to do better every day. And so I would like to finish my introduction with the following caveat. If you see me crying today, it is absolutely because I'm a menopausal woman who cries at everything, and not because I'm immensely proud of my friend and now fellow professor, Emily Nordmann. Okay, thank you. I've been worried that I ever practiced this so much that I will have blunted the emotion, but I think we can safely say that's not much of a problem. So, first of all, thank you all for coming. Some of you have traveled significant distances, and I really do appreciate it. And thank you to Neve for an introduction. Oh boy, if I can live up to them, I'll give it a go. So this talk is going to be split into 4 thematic parts. First of all, I'm going to do a brief history of time, which will be kind of the chronological career journey. Then I'm going to do some musings on leadership. Then there will be kind of the traditional research inaugural bit, and I'm going to talk about my papers and what I mean by evidence-informed education more broadly.
And then finally, there will be the Oscars acceptance speech part of the proceedings. And I will attempt to truly convey my gratitude for the fact that I'm standing here. I'm just going to warn you now that I have decided to cash in 10 years of punctuality and never overrunning a lecture, and I am going to talk for a full hour. So if you need the toilet, if you've got a train to catch, or if you just lose the will to live, that's fine. But otherwise, strap it. So before I get going, I just want to give a bit of context to everything that I'm going to say, and indeed to my career more broadly. As some of you know, I come from a background of multiple deprivation, and I am, for once, going to talk about this at the end. But the reason I want to mention it at the start is because in my old age, I have come to the realization that I make a lot more sense if you know people up front. Like, not just how I am personally, but, when I look back at my career on the things I have chosen to work on and what I get very passionate about and very angry about, I make a lot more sense if you know that when I talk about inclusion and fairness and access to opportunity, that these are not things that I read about. These are things that I did not have for a longer part of my life than was fair. The second thing is that I have worked very hard. And I am not going to gaslight anyone by pretending that what I am about to present happened on 35 hours a week. I will also add, I have taken every single one of my annual leave days this year. And since COVID, it is genuinely rare that I work a weekend or an evening. Writing this talk, not easy. But finally, despite the first 2 points, I have been very, very lucky. And I'm also really conscious that I have survivorship bias. It might be the multiple deprivation talking, but I think academia is great, right? Like, yes, everything is on fire, but I fundamentally love my job. And, also, I think that our LCS track and our promotion system is robust and fair and world leading. But also, I would say that, wouldn't I? It's worked out quite well for me. So I also want to take the opportunity to highlight where it wasn't hard work or my own natural brilliance. It was just right time, right place, right people. So I am originally from very rural Northumberland, and I escaped at the age of 19 to the University of Edinburgh, where I did my undergraduate degree in psychology. And I really wasn't a very strong student, like not failing, but like just not strong. So I graduated with a low 2-1. It would have been about a B3 in Glasgow money. And so no one saw profit 40 me. But what I lacked in polished academic ability, I did make up for in being a little bit mad and really caring about stuff. And I'd gotten very, very obsessed with sign language and the politics of deafness. And my main extracurricular activity when I was at uni was I founded the British Sign Language Society with the person who would become and still is my best friend, Francis. So because I was a bit unhinged and I wouldn't take no for an answer, I actually had 2 supervisors for my undergraduate dissertation. The first was Louise Kelly from psychology. And one of the reasons I wanted Louise as a supervisor, aside from her expertise, was that Louise was from Newcastle and she had a really recognisable Geordie accent. And at the time, I had a much stronger accent than I do now. I purposely tried to get rid of it when I was at Edinburgh. I loved my time at Edinburgh, but the social class dynamics are right. And being around Louise, I just felt like I could breathe out when I was with her. And then it was a couple of years ago. I was at graduation and I turned round and there she was. That's Louise Kelly. And when it turns out her son studied psychology at Glasgow and I taught him for 4 years. And it was just this really wonderful personal moment because all of his feelings came rushing back. I haven't seen her in 15 years. And I nearly burst into tears. But it was also a really important professional reminder of the difference that we can make in our students' lives. It's a weird privilege to experience both sides of that. My second supervisor was Rachel O'Neill from the School of Education. And I'm very touched that Rachel's here today. The reason I needed a second supervisor was because my project was a little bit ambitious. I don't know why you let me do it. I wouldn't let me do it. But anyway, so I decided that I was going to test the language skills of deaf children who were taught in different educational systems. So I self-funded this mad road trip all around the UK. So I went to deaf schools from Bradford to Dingwall. And the actual dissertation itself was garbage, right? But I did learn a lot of quite important project management skills. Rachel was a lecturer in deaf education, and Rachel's very much my first source of luck. First of all, she didn't have to take me on, wasn't in her school, wasn't in her workload, but also, oh God, I don't normally get emotional at this point. This doesn't bode well for later. In the summer of 2008, after I graduated, Rachel sent me a job advert for a post at the University of Aberdeen. And I absolutely would not have seen that job without Rachel sending it on. And it feels like this really overly dramatic kind of sliding doors moment to say that Rachel thinking of me in that one moment and sending that email changed my entire life. But it did. Sandy's online. So, so off I went to Aberdeen. The job ad that Rachel had sent me was for a research assistant on a project investigating numerical cognition in deaf children. And the reason I got the interview at all was largely about the extracurricular stuff I'd done with the Sign Language Society, which is why we should give students the space and the credit, all of the other stuff they do. And my second source of luck is that halfway through the interview, they said, and would you like to do a PhD? And the reason that was so lucky is because I simply would not have gotten onto a PhD program with my grades. Not then, and definitely not now. And I didn't even think I was going to get the job at the time. When I went to my interview at Aberdeen, I had accepted the job of the manager of a video game store in Edinburgh. And I said to them, like, I've got this dream job interview next week. Like, it's not going to happen, but I'll let you know. My third source of luck is that I was assigned Sandy Fellows as one of my PhD supervisors. Now, I could give a lecture just on the virtues of Sandy Fellows. And I would tell you about her integrity and her professionalism and her respect for teaching and research and admin and just doing your damn bit. And I would also tell you about her compassion and her support. And I could speak for hours, and it would come absolutely nowhere near to explaining how much I love her and how grateful I am, first of all, for her supervision, and then for 15 years of friendship. I love you. So I stayed at Aberdeen a little bit longer than I intended. I was there for 10 years in total. My PhD was part-time alongside the RA job, and then I went straight into being a teaching fellow. And for me, the teaching track was always a conscious choice, and it was always a first choice. Didn't want to do a postdoc. Don't regret not doing a postdoc at all, because by the time I finished my PhD, I knew that I wanted to be education focused. And I think another source of luck is that I was at Aberdeen. And those of you who know me know that I don't always say the nicest things about the University of Aberdeen. I will give them their due, and I will say that I was incredibly lucky to start my career there, because Aberdeen brought in the teaching track about the same time that I got my permanent contract. And so for me, the idea that you could be a teaching focused professor was always a possibility, and it was always something to aim for. And I like to think that that shows not only in the work that I have done, but in the pride that I take in my career. Like, I am not and have never been a plan B, darlings. So I was teaching fellow until 2015. I got my grade 7 lectureship, and I also did my PG cert and HEA fellowship. And that turned out to be very influential, because at Aberdeen, the PG cert involved a full research project. and I did mine on lecture capture, which we will come back to. So I came to Glasgow in November 2018 as a grade 8 lecturer. And I know it's not possible for everyone because of finances and family and whatever, but I think if you do get the chance to move institution at least once in your career, do it. It was the making of me. But the reason I came to Glasgow is because of the work the team were doing on open science and reproducibility. So this is when the replication crisis was engulfing psychology. But the psychology at Glasgow were leading the way internationally. And I am so proud that we continue with that work and that profile to this day. We had our BPS accreditation earlier in the week, and one of our commendations is about open science and data skills, and we're still leading the way. And I'm so proud of the entire team and the work we do. But I was aware of this because I connected with Neve on Twitter. And I saw what they were doing, because not only were they teaching their students open science, but they were talking about it openly and giving it away. And I was like, I want to be part of that. I want to be part of a team at a school that was willing to do the right thing, not the easy thing. So a lot of my focus in my early days in Glasgow was on teaching research tactics and data skills. I also stepped into the role again as level 1 lead, which is something I've done in Aberdeen. And as I might have mentioned once or twice, is a job I kind of like. But Glasgow expanded my life and my career in ways I couldn't have predicted. I was allowed and indeed encouraged to do rainbow office hours, which was not the case at Aberdeen. I got to perform stand-up with the Stand Comedy Club. So my entire time here, I have been just supported and encouraged to push myself and to remember to say yes. And I've had the stupidest adventures. Nothing will ever beat being interviewed about lecture capture opposite the Matterhorn. What I'm not saying is that being at Glasgow has always been rosy. Aside from anything else, I commuted from Aberdeen for the first 6 months, and over my dead body will I ever get my medical skin. But more seriously, as a school, we have had some issues with culture. We've had some issues with the distribution of workload. And many people have suffered from that, myself included. I cried at my desk 5 days into my new job because of how much I'd been given. And then COVID hit. And I think COVID is the only time in 10 years that my wife has ever truly worried about my relationship with work. It really wasn't good. What I see now is that my success is both a product of the good and the bad. And I'm not going to pretend this is all planned. It all looks very tidy in retrospect, but it's post-hoc. But it's nice to reflect that, after having my own issues with workload, I became Deputy Director of Education and made workload my thing. And that also that after, benefiting so much from an environment and a team that supported and encouraged and funded my educational research and profile, that I got to lead pedagogy and education research unit and psychology. And now that I get to lead and help support LTS staff all across the college, which is a job I love so much. I actually apologized to Sarah Chris and Willie last week for how much I liked my life. I couldn't be anywhere else. I'm really grateful. So happily disproving the person who told me not to move to Glasgow because I wouldn't get promoted. I got a senior lecturer in 2021. I got a principal fellow in 2024, and then in 2025 was promoted to Professor of Evidence-Informed Education. And here you find me. So I thought that given that what gets you across is leadership, whether that's teaching or research, that I should have a section that was my musings on leadership. But then I also thought that will be insufferable. So instead, I've decided to give you my musings on leadership as expressed through the medium of love letters to 4 people who have taught me it. So my first source of leadership inspiration is Professor Paul Bishop, who's now hiding in the front of them. So Paul started his career at Glasgow, then he moved to Aberdeen, where I met him as director of teaching. And now he's at the University of York. So what can I tell you about Paul Bishop? I can tell you that my pride and my respect for the teaching craft probably originates with Paul, because that's what he modelled. I can also tell you that he seemed to have a knack for giving me roles that clearly played to my strengths rather than just filling a workload hole. But you never let me stand still. I was always challenged and pushed the right amount. And I can also tell you about Paul's influence on my sartorial choices. But instead, my most important lesson from Paul comes from the many, many times that Paul told me off. Some of my colleagues in psychology will semi-lovingly refer to going full Nordmann. For those of you who don't know me that well, I have a little bit of a temper. And sometimes it's quite fun and honestly quite effective. And sometimes it's not. And it is something that I will have to work on for my entire life. And I'm very grateful to those of you these days who take my venting in private to help manage it. I have but there were a few times, what I should say is, what my colleagues in psychology probably don't appreciate is that this is the calm version of Emily Nordmann. And you have Paul to thank for a lot of that. Because there was more than one occasion earlier in my career when my behaviour just wasn't good enough. And Paul told me in no uncertain terms. And I hated him at the time. Not because he was wrong, but because I was embarrassed at myself. But I'm so glad he did, because I needed to hear it. And I'm not saying I'm perfect now, but I wouldn't be standing here if he hadn't have said it and if I hadn't have listened. And the thing that has stuck with me, aside from getting people to proofread my emails before I click send, is how hard it is to get the tone of those conversations right. Like, I've been sitting with people and I've gone in far too soft. It does happen. And I'm like, they haven't heard me. They haven't heard how serious this is. And then I've been with people and I've gone in far too hard and they haven't heard me because the defense comes down. And, you know, you did get it right. And I don't know if I've ever told you that. So I am very grateful. My second source of leadership inspiration you have already met, Professor Neve Stack. And the idea that I worked for Neve 4 years, like 3 or 4 years, it's just inconceivable because of the influence that Neve has had and continues to have on me. So what can I tell you about Professor Neve Stack? Many of you might have read or heard about visionary leadership. I consider myself to be in an extremely small group of people who has ever truly experienced it. And what Neve has given me as a leader more than anything is a core belief that if you want people to follow you, you don't have to be perfect, but you do have to stand for something. I can also tell you that Neve has a knack for making you believe in yourself. And I'm so grateful that I got to experience a leader who isn't threatened by the success of others. And also who understands that whilst there is no I in team, there is a motivation. Also an invoice. And I can also tell you about Neve's influence on my sartorial choices. The thing I really want to tell you about is my flats. So the year before I left Aberdeen, I had several homophobic comments in the Edises. And it really wasn't handled very well by the school. I think it was maybe the first time it happened. I was maybe the first openly gay lecturer, but even so, the head of school should have known not to tell me that I just shouldn't have been talking about my personal life. And so a couple of weeks before I left for Glasgow in 2018, it's National Coming Out Day. And I had put up big flags in my office window because my office was on the ground floor and the head of school had to walk past there every day. And I am petty, right? And I put a photo of the flags on Twitter, and Neve had known what had happened kind of in the background. And I got to Glasgow and I'm in my office and I'm unpacking my boxes. And Neve walks in. And the first thing she said to me was, "Where are your flags?" And here's the thing. I would go into battle beneath staff without asking what we are fighting for. And I understand that what I've just described there is a cause. And I don't care. It is the most wonderful and empowering thing to be truly seen for who you are and what you need. And if I come anywhere close to making any member of my team feel the same way, that would be a very good day. My third source of inspiration is Dr. Will Toivo. Now, Will's not my mentor, I am hers. But I wanted to acknowledge that I have learned just as much from my junior colleagues as I have from my senior. So what can I tell you about Will Toivo? I can tell you that whilst on balance, I think I've helped Will more than I've hindered her. There was also a time when I put far too much pressure on her about promotion. And I had to learn a really, really important lesson that what works and motivates and drives you isn't the same for everyone. I can also tell you that having had one of the first lockdown vivas, Will's first few years as an LTS academic involved a level of pressure that was inhumane. This does not bode well for the end. There are no words to describe how proud I am that as soon as she found herself on solid ground, first thing you did was reach back to help people coming up behind you. I can also tell you that I have never been so sure that Will is my academic child than when we both travelled to San Francisco and I had forgotten to book the hotel and Will hadn't registered for the conference, but we both expected someone else to do it for us. But mainly, I want to tell you about trust. So as I said, Will had a very rough first few years post-PhD. Workload is a real issue. We were having a meeting in kind of August, September 2023. And I had been imposed as Deputy Director for Education for a little bit. We'd started the work on workload, but it was still very much in its infancy. I said to Will, "This year's going to be better. We're not going to break you this year." She just sat there, looked at me, and went, "I don't trust you." And obviously my instinctive reaction was, and then I got over myself and I realised that she was absolutely right, because the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour. And trust is earned. And people will very, very quickly lose faith in your leadership unless you can actually follow through on all of the talk. The fourth source of inspiration will come later. So it's research. I have had a proper existential crisis about what to present in this section, because even with an hour, there wasn't time for all the papers. So if you're wondering where all of the open science stuff is, it's on the OSF. That's a really good joke for a very particular kind of nerd. So the main focus of my research, and the thing I've published the most on, is lecture capture. So for those of you who aren't fully embroiled in higher education, this refers to recording your lectures so that students can watch them back at a later date, either for revision or because they missed the original lecture. So my first approach to studying lecture capture was to focus in on the issue of whether providing recordings lowers attendance. It's the most common concern that if you record, students won't turn up. The short version of that is no, right? It doesn't, or at least not to any meaningful degree. And there are a bunch of other things you should worry about first before you worry about recordings. The primary one being, is the lecture any good? Also, are your students working 45 hours a week? So my first paper, which as I said was the research project for my PhD served, looked at the relationship between lecture attendance, lecture recordings, and achievement in the exam at different levels. So it's cross-sectional, but we had levels 1 to 4. And the two big important findings for me from that paper were, first of all, that students who had English as a second language used the recording significantly more in the first semester of level 1, but then that difference went away in later levels. So recordings were helping to support that transition point. But the other important finding was that the relationship between attendance, recording use, and achievement was moderated by GPA, so their grade point average, how strong they were academically. So what we found is that for students who had an average or a high GPA, if they had low attendance, then the more they watched the recording, that predicted doing better in the exam, right? But the students who had a low GPA, the weaker students, if they had low attendance, didn't really matter how much of the recordings they watched, they weren't capable of catching up independently. So the follow-up to that paper then focused in on this idea that it's not about lecture capture. Lecture capture is a tool, right? It's about the underlying study skills and the underlying self-regulation. And disadvantaged students who are coming in, from a more deprived background, they're less likely to come in with these study skills fully developed. So if you shift the focus away from lecture capture towards broader study skills, you can do a lot more good. So with that in mind, we synthesized what was already known from the educational and the cognitive literature to come up with a set of guidelines for how students could use lecture recordings most effectively. So we wrote a paper, and we had these student-facing infographics. And I was really, really lucky to be able to work with Carolina as learning scientist extraordinaire on this paper. But it was the student-facing infographics that really, really took off. And I very much have my former PhD student, Gabby Lepin, to thank with it, because this was his beautiful design. But also we made these infographics available open access and with a Creative Commons license, so anyone could reuse and adapt them. And because of that, they were translated into Dutch, French, German, and Welsh. They were adopted by universities all across the world. And the University of Edinburgh printed tens of thousands of copies of them, and I really have to thank them because I think that got me senior lecturer. Those papers and a couple of other others that I don't have time for are focused on attendance and study skills. But actually, it's the next set that I'm the proudest of, and that I hope is my research legacy, because this is the inclusivity set. So the first paper in this set was conducted as part of a QAA collaborative cluster project. And it was with Jill Mackay from the University of Edinburgh, who is my very long-standing lecture capture partner in crime, and Jackie Hutchinson from the University of Aberdeen, as well as the Widening participation team from the University of Glasgow. So the focus groups from this study were conducted in early 2020. We started in person, we finished in the first week of lockdown. And all the students in those groups who come through Widening participation routes. So for those of you who don't know, Widening participation is kind of like any kind of thing of disadvantaged students, so from poorer backgrounds, caring responsibilities, refugees, that kind of thing. And you can see the socially progressive case for lecture recordings jumping out so clearly from these quotes. And remember, this is pre-inflation. This is pre-cost of living crisis. This is the good old days of 2020. I can go to work and earn money. I live quite far away. It costs me a lot to get in. For these students, lecture capture allowed them to make a choice. Not through laziness, not through poor study strategies, but a rational choice that every single one of us now make on a daily basis about balancing working from home with going into the office. The next study in that set, the follow-up was about widening participation experiences of online learning during the pandemic. Although thanks to academic publishing, it was only finally published at the start of this year. And I'm very proud that it's Will's first ever scholarship paper as well. Now, a lot of what was said in that study goes beyond just lecture recordings, but the theme that was relevant was that of resource agency. And it spoke to so much of what was said in that first study. There was so much that was awful and more difficult during COVID. But a really strong theme that came through was that for many of our most disadvantaged students, they felt like they were in control for the first time. And this was to do, for example, with the impact of removing commuting. Not, there wasn't just a financial gain, there was a productivity boost. They're not sitting on a train with crappy ScotRail Wi-Fi for 2 hours and then coming home absolutely knackered. The third study in that set was a qualitative study we did looking at how disabled and neurodivergent students use lecture recordings. And I was very glad to be able to work with Chiara Horlan on this paper. So Chiara founded the Neurodiversity Network at Glasgow, and she also did the fantastically rich thematic analysis on this paper. I did a quant bit, it was cut to the paper. The key findings for me from this paper are that overwhelmingly the students were talking about using lecture recordings to complement and consolidate their learning rather than replace in-person attendance. And part of this was about being able to use the features of the technology. So, pause the recording, speed them up, slow them down, use subtitles to overcome issues of auditory processing. And the second big theme was that recordings provide a flexible safety net. Now, I've already touched on some of this stuff, care and responsibilities, illness, commuting, council trains. Life gets in the way, right? But it was also about care and safety. So given our sample, we had a number of chronically ill and medically vulnerable students. And just sometimes the lecture environment with lots of people was simply unsafe for them. And again, what really, really leapt out to me from this theme is something I've already touched on. For every single academic I know, we all use this type of flexibility. For some, it's about the commute. For some, it's childcare. Some people just prefer working at home. Why is that okay for us and not for our students? Like, you often get the argument that, universities should be preparing students for life in the real world, as if somehow your time here is just make-believe. Succeeding in the real world now frequently involves flexible and hybrid working and having the regulation to keep up, regardless of whether or not you're in person or online. It's also at this point that I really need to clarify something very important here, which is that despite everything I have said, I think attendance is super important, right? I have argued with my own school for 7 years to take attendance. And we finally did it across the board this year, but I think that's just because UKVI are more persuasive. There is an extremely strong link between attendance and achievement. And yes, I know that attendance and engagement are not the same, but they are strongly correlated. And it does my head in when people try and argue that it's not inclusive to tell students that attendance is important, or that we can't build engagement into our assessments. You can be flexible, you can be compassionate, but telling students that they will do just as well if they don't attend or engage, it is the tyranny of lowered expectations, right? It's not inclusive, it's setting them up to fail and be lonely. So what I'm not saying is that attendance doesn't matter, it does. What I am saying is that there is no strong evidence that providing recordings lowers attendance. What I am saying is that you can still scaffold and support attendance and engagement whilst being flexible for those who need it the most, by teaching students explicitly about study skills and saying all of the quiet bits out loud. In COVID, we said that lecture recordings were just as good. And if you've seen the news this week, that's been challenged in court, right? We now have to justify why that's apparently not the case anymore and why they're not as good. And I don't think they are. But we have to say that out loud. We have to explain ourselves. I'm also not naive. There's always a trade-off, right? Will there be a small number of students who don't come to your lecture specifically because it's recorded? Yes. My question to those who refuse to record or refuse to release their recordings is quite simply, who are you willing to push to ensure that a handful of undeserving students don't get access to the education they are paying through the nose for? So the next set of papers lead into the evidence-informed category. So it's maybe worth explaining what I mean by that and why I chose it as my professorial designation. I think it's really, really important that we have an evidence base for our learning and teaching. But also, as education-focused academics, that we contribute to that evidence base through our scholarship. But I also think that one of the problems I see, particularly with junior LTS staff, is an obsession with collecting and reporting on primary data, which might be a discipline-specific hangover. Because actually, I think that you can have just as much, if not more, impact, not by being the person who collects the data, but by being the person who is really, really well informed by the literature and the wider political context and can take all of it and translate it into practical, pragmatic guidance. Related, it's really, really hard to do educational research well that is also ecologically valid and that scales to our classroom. So sometimes it's not possible to have a specific evidence base. You have to bring in what you know about a bunch of things to inform what you are going to do. So the lecture capture recommendation paper fits in that bracket. But I think that the best example of this that I have is our paper, 10 Simple Rules for Supporting a Temporary Online Pivot in Higher Education. So we wrote this about, what we thought was a temporary pivot. We wrote this paper in April 2020. And I was lucky that as level 1 lead, all the first year exams were cancelled. Thank you very much, Myra, for the vision. So actually, I had some time for research. Don't worry, I did pay for it in the September. It's okay. But this paper is a really good example of why open science is your friend, because we made it available as a preprint. First of all, to get feedback, but also because we wanted it to be available at the time it was helpful, when people were actually working on their teaching. It wasn't published until the October. But we hit that timing just right. The preprint was downloaded 1,000 times in the first 6 days. Like, we all got together and had champagne on Zoom. But the thing I'm most proud of with that paper is that it is pragmatic, because I got hugely frustrated before writing it, that there was a lot of the education community sharing all of this research about how online teaching is just as good as in-person teaching. And I'm like, if your students chose to learn online, like, the entire evidence base at the time was about ODL teaching. I am about to have 700 first-year students who wanted an on-campus experience. They wanted all of the shenanigans that entails, and instead they're going to be prisoners in their room. Don't tell me this is going to be just as good. So there's another example. Carolina and I, your name's beautiful when it's spelled right, isn't it? We published this paper on our approach to watch parties. So watch parties are where you record the lecture in advance, but then you stream it at a set time. And the reason we did this is that we were really, really worried about taking away the lack of contact and the lack of routine. I was level 1 lead, Carolina was level 2 lead, and our overwhelming concern was, if we just make the lectures available as a recording, we're going to lose the students. Like, none of them have had to do online learning before. We need to give them a routine, a time to come together as a community. Flexibility is great. Being left to learn on your own when that's not what you wanted, not so great. this is what I mean by evidence informed rather than evidence based, because pretty much the entire evidence base at the time told you to go asynchronous for flexibility, because it wasn't connected up to absolutely everything we know, both from the literature and just being on the ground in person with on campus first year students. It's at this point that it's time to talk about my fourth source of leadership inspiration. Dr. Kathleen Cromie, otherwise known as my wife. This is an entirely professional dedication. So what can I tell you about Dr. Kathleen Cromie that won't get me divorced? Those of you who know Kathleen will know that she is a singing teacher and musical director. But I think that fewer of you know that she has a PhD, and even fewer again know that that PhD was on educational leadership. And it turns out that having a living coach is quite helpful. I can also tell you that Kathleen's work on hormonal voice change and transgender and menopausal voices is inclusion at its finest. Not because it's woke nonsense, but because of its simplicity and just working with the person that you have in front of you. And I could also tell you about Kathleen's influence on my sartorial traces, but I just mean I'm wearing her pants. I'm not. But what I really want to tell you about is Sister Act. So, Kathleen is the musical director of Loud and Proud, which is Scotland's first LGBTQ choir. And she had this job when we went into lockdown. Now, if you think that pivoting your lectures online is difficult, try running a choir online. You can't. For those of you who don't know, the lag doesn't work. It's an absolute mess. So when lockdown hit, most choirs just stopped. At best, they got everyone to send in individuals singing and they stitched them together. For the entire pandemic, Loud and Proud did not miss a single rehearsal. And I watched my wife just figure it out as she went. I watched as the house filled with studio level recording equipment. But more importantly, I watched the greatest act of leadership I think I will ever see. Because the reason that Kathleen kept the choir going was that she understood that being part of a choir is not all about the singing. It's important. People join a queer choir for the community, to feel safe once a week. And whilst it wasn't the same, she refused to give up on them. She refused to leave that hole in their lives, no matter what it cost her. So there's one night in lockdown, and we're watching Sister Act, and it's that scene where Dolores gets the choir together for the first time and they make a really nice sound. And they're all really happy and everything. And I look over, and Kathleen is in floods of tears. I said, "What's wrong?" And she just said, "I miss my job. I miss being in the room with people. I miss feeling the magic that I helped create." Everything that I think about learning and teaching and staff and student well-being in the wake of COVID has Kathleen's influence all over it. Because what I learned from watching her with the choir is that if you are trying to figure out the answer to your problems, you can't just look at the surface, because otherwise all you will see is the singing. You have to look 2 or 3 levels down. Are lectures the best way to learn? Maybe not. But what happens? What's the unintended consequences for students of taking away time on campus with their peers? What are the consequences for staff when they don't get to feel the magic that they helped create? I want to end the evidence-informed bit with 2 examples that aren't based on papers. The first is rainbow office hours. So I've mentioned them a couple of times in passing, but for those of you who don't know, rainbow office hours are where LGBTQ staff put on an extra hour of office hours a couple of times a year and LGBTQ students can come and talk to them about anything queer related. So it started in 2019 in psychology, and there were three of us. And it's now institution-wide. It's been adopted by other universities, and it's now led by Raphael Benson, whose sights set on world domination. The reason Rainbow Office Hours is such a good example of evidence-informed rather than evidence-based is that I do not have the specific data to support it. One of the reasons Rainbow Office Hours is really, really difficult to evaluate is that very few students actually turn up at that set office hour. Instead, they turn up a couple of months later and they finally plucked up the courage. And actually, its power isn't in the office hour. The power is that there is this list of, educated, successful people who are also willing to be openly and visibly queer. I don't have the data for Rainbow Office Hours. What I do have is an absolutely huge literature on the power of representation, on the importance of visible role models for campus climate and supporting minority students, and for the impact on staff of not having to hide your personal life at work. I don't have the data for Rainbow Office Hours, but I can tell you it is the most evidence-informed thing I have ever designed. It's also probably the part of my job that gives me the most joy. Like, I purposefully out myself in my first year lecture. And every year you just see this ripple of baby gays going, oh my God, she's one of us. And they learn nothing from the rest of the lecture. But I don't care. You cannot be what you cannot see. And all I care is that they see that you can be successful in a traditional, prestigious job, and also unashamedly, unapologetically queer. For my final example of evidence-informed education, I want to talk about the difference between widening access and widening participation. Because getting students through the door is only half the battle. And the thing that makes genuine inclusion so difficult is that you can't just look at the surface, because otherwise all you will see is the simming. Instead, we need to attack our systemic issues, interrogate the structures and the policies that create those barriers, even when those barriers might be invisible to us, or worse, when we have convinced ourselves that they are justified. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important to be holistically evidence-informed, because if you have a good understanding of the literature and the wider political context and your own data, that's when you can see where leadership is truly needed. So this difference between access and participation is reflected in the updated government targets. So it used to be that Scottish universities had to aim for 20% of our students to come from the 20% most deprived, MD 20, multiple deprivation 20. That guidance has been updated in recent years to give it a little bit more nuance. So it's now not just the number of students we take in, but what do we do with them when they get here? And when we look at our data at the school level, we can see exactly what this means in practice. This is data from psychology, or I should be very careful to say this is a simulated synthetic data set, and on the advice of the vice principal, I've also cleared this with data protection to present. So it's not the real data, but the patterns are what we see in the data. So what this graph shows is the performance of our students from levels 1 to level 4. So GPA is on the y-axis there, so that's their average grade. Okay, our MD 20 students, most deprived students, are in the blue bars, and everyone else is in the purple. So what we can see here is that in first and second year, there's quite a clear gap between these two groups of students. Our disadvantaged students are doing worse, but by level 4, they catch up. The gap pretty much closes. This pattern is not unique to us. Okay, I need to look for this in our data because the literature has shown for years that students from deprived backgrounds tend to struggle more in first and second year because they're less likely to come in with those all-important study skills, knowledge of the hidden curriculum, how to do university, effectively. But the reason I went digging into our data wasn't just to do a replication. It's because I was also informed by our local context. So for those of you who don't know, psychology has progression criteria from level 2 to level 3. In order to get guaranteed entry into level 3, you have to get a B2 on average, although in most years we enforce it at a B3, which is a GPA of 50. So let me just add in that line there. For anyone who has missed the uncomfortable truth that I'm trying to highlight, to get into level 3, the grade you need is currently higher than the average grade of our MD20 students. So what this means, so we can talk all we like about how inclusive we are as a school or as an institution, but actually it turns out that our structures systemically exclude those people who claim we want to support. What keeps me awake at night about this is that because of that progression line, we don't know how these students would have done. We don't know how big our attainment gap actually is because we get rid of them before we get to find out. It might be that our attainment gap is much worse than we think it is, and that actually they're not catching up. This is just sampling bias from the ones who are left. Or it might be that the ones that we write off in level 2 would have caught up if we'd let them stay. And if you want a concrete example of this and why I can't, and I just won't let this go. In 2006, Professor Nordmann got a C1 in level 2. And when I look at this data, I am forced to confront the fact that the single biggest source of luck in my entire career is that I did not accept the offer I had from Glasgow. Inclusion is difficult. It's why being data-driven and evidence-informed is essential, because inclusion requires you to ask hard questions of yourself. This was not the first time that this sentiment has been expressed at Glasgow in recent weeks, but it is a good one, so I will steal it. We are all to blame for this, not just the psychologists. We have all let our overly complex structures and processes fall on our most disadvantaged students. We have all done the easy thing, not the right thing. And I include myself in this. I have failed as Deputy Director of Education, as convener of Transitions Working Group, to do the work that would change this. I owe it to that yellow line to keep trying as Associate Dean. And if that doesn't work, maybe run Vice Principal. I'd like to say I wrote that line before me. I want to finish by returning to this slide and to go into a bit more detail on that first point. And I want to make it very, very clear that what I am about to say is not intended to elicit sympathy or as a sob story. But I want to tell you who I am and where I've come from. The first reason I want to do this is because I have always understood the power of representation. Even before that's what I knew it was called, I knew that Louise Kelly having a Geordie accent was incredibly powerful to me. And whilst I haven't hidden my background, I certainly make a lot of jokes about it, it's not something I've talked about much in a professional context, not in the same way that I've made being queer part of my professional identity. But I know that there will be both staff and students here today whose story might be similar to my own. So I suppose if ever there was a day to represent, it's probably today. But the second bigger reason is that for me, the point of this inaugural, aside from being the centre of attention, is to say thank you. And I just can't find a way to make that thank you way enough without explaining why this means so much to me. I am also not going to make this through without crying, right? If I can still speak, that's a win for therapy. And thank you to Ailsa, who will be watching this later. I come from a background of multiple deprivation. What that means to me is that I grew up in poverty. Not the kind we starve, but certainly the kind where all you can eat buffets pose a genuine challenge as an adult. And where every part of life is just grindingly more difficult and more humiliating than it needs to be. From too young an age, this seemed like such a good idea. From too young an age, my mother was an alcoholic, and I have borne the brunt. I have borne the brunt of both her attention and her neglect. At the same time, I also had the pleasure of an abusive stepfather who spent the best part of a decade ensuring I knew I was truly, truly worthless. Because of all of this, I left home when I was 16. I moved in with someone I will never be able to repay. And I worked my way through my A levels and Wetherspoons as a microwave chef. I have some problems with my memory, particularly for that time of my life. But my main reflection looking back is that no one knew what to do with a 16-year-old who was living independently and working and also trying to do the traditional studying thing, least of all the 16-year-old herself. So, for example, during my A levels, I had a 47% attendance rate. And the reason I know it was 47% is because they sent a letter home, because that's what you did when a student was struggling. But of course, they sent the letter to my home, to me, it's my own parents. And I don't know why I find this so funny, because it's really just quite sad. But I used to write my own sick notes. So, you know, like if you'd missed school and your mum was supposed to do it, I'd be like, "Dear Miss Boggs, Emily wasn't at school yesterday because she didn't want to go. That's a love, Emily." We can all see it. But I also remember that at the end of my A levels, they did one of the stupid award ceremonies, like who's most likely to be prime minister, who was most likely to have turned up the class in a full Newcastle United football strip. And the award they gave me was most likely to have made an excuse for not having done her homework. And I look back on that now, knowing everything I know about student support and well-being. And I think, well, yes, they were. But wouldn't it have been nice if someone had asked if I was okay instead? The consequence of all of this is that when I got to university, I had absolutely no study skills or self-regulation. I just had a bit of raw talent and an awful lot of anger. Given all this, it might not come as a shock when I tell you I'm estranged from every member of my family except for my sister. Seemed like such a good idea to do this.
You're doing great. You can do it.
There is a lot of chat about how academia is just a job. And for the overwhelming majority, I'm so on board. But for me, it's not. And I'm so trying not to swear in front of lawyers. I really want that job. For me, it's not. And I don't mean this in the way that I don't have any identity or any interests outside of work. That's not the case. Rather, what I mean is that with a handful of exceptions, when I look back on my life, every single person who has ever made me feel like I matter every single person who has ever believed in me, every single person who has ever made me feel not just not worthless, but worthy of this. Every single one of you is here. I know that some of you will hear that and think it's impossibly sad. Like, my in-laws are just like having, a bit. But I can't tell you enough that that's not what I see. Because what I see is that there are far too many people who have a story like mine and much, much worse. And instead what I see is that I could live my life 100 times over. And in 99 of them, I would not be telling my story as part of a professorial lecture in the most ostentatious room I could find. But I would still be in that kitchen at Wetherspoons. And the difference between those versions of my life isn't me. It's you, my chosen family. I don't want to end on a trauma porn, because it will make things more awkward than the fact that this said trauma porn from my. So instead, I want to end as full Nordmann with a provocation and a challenge to you all. Higher education is under attack. And make no mistake, we're losing. We're under attack from AI tech pros who know or care nothing about learning and teaching, but they do move faster than us. We're under attack from successive governments who have decided that one of the UK's main cultural and financial exports is not a politically viable argument. And we're under attack from people who think diversity of thought is something to avoid at all costs. And fueled by all of this, the rhetoric that there are too many children going to university is back on the agenda, and it's getting louder. The reason I wanted to tell you where I come from is so that you can understand the full extent of my fury when I say that your first, last, and only response to that rhetoric should be whose children will still get to go. I know that our jobs are increasingly difficult, and there are parts of modern higher education that make me want to scream, but never, ever lose sight that for more people than will ever get to stand on a stage and tell you education is the only way out, and living proof. So my challenge to you is this. If anything I had said today about inclusion struck a chord, don't stick a rainbow flag on your office door or write a profound social media post about recognizing your privilege. Go and do the work it requires. Record your damn lectures. Explain your hidden curriculum. Mentor your junior colleagues. Make the difficult financial decisions than when we don't write off students who just need a little longer to escape where they have come from. But most of all, my challenge to you is that no matter how hard things might get, never, ever forget that what we do here matters. Because what we do changes lives. So thank you